Do you have a favorite?
Not meant to. But mostly the unloved ones. The unvisited ones. The cases that get dusty and ignored. All the broken and shunned creatures. Someone's got to care for them. Who shall it be if not us?
Yes.
Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the very best new and old ideas for living in this world. Coming to you from 43 degrees south on a small farm in deepest Tasmania. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host.
Oh, something popped up. We are live streaming. Am I alone in Gordon's page? No, I still don't see me live on Gordon's YouTube page.
Yeah, we found it. We had to... Zoom was sent
there it is.
YouTube. And then we had to switch it on in YouTube, and then YouTube said it failed twice. So if you are watching it...
Horrible actions and lives of the human.
There we go.
Yes, we are live on YouTube.
This is going to be relevant for some of the films we're going to discuss. So I'm going to switch off because I can hear you coming through the YouTube.
Yeah, we found it.
In the background.
Yeah, mute that blowhard.
Yeah, those two terrible people. All right. We return to literally the scheduled program. Yeah, so I think what you were saying about here we are at the end of civilization is a mood, and it's the right. And it's why I wanted to have this chat with you, right? Whatever you think is going on, that's kind of inarguable. And there are mystic and mythic and fictional modes of or opportunities of thinking with where we are that I think can position ourselves individually and our families in the best way possible to kind of ride the waves of it, right? Because and that's why I wanted to talk about cyberpunk in particular, I think, and funnily enough, it's because I had hoped we would be able to get to a solar punk future without having to go through a cyberpunk phase. And it turns out we have to go through a cyberpunk phase. And so I figured, well, we need to have a chat about what cyberpunk is, what are some of the, not just good, but cornerstone, particularly filmic representations or explorations of it, and how cyberpunk can relate to various philosophies like Gnosticism and all the rest of it, right? So we're gonna, for people playing along, we're gonna be doing a countdown of the films. But before that, Miguel, what do you think cyberpunk is?
Well, I would say it is very Gnostic. I would say, first, I'd also like to say, beyond the end of the world, I would like to welcome everybody to the Age of Hermes. I think it started in 2016, but I think we're deep in the Age of Hermes. So, of course, technology plays into it. I would advise people to really embrace this deity and, of course, embrace someone who we'll be talking a lot about today, Philip K. Dick. He said that sometimes it's an appropriate response to reality to go insane. This would be a good time, but the right type of insanity as we unpack a little bit more about Hermes. But I guess the official line of cyberpunk is a reaction to traditional science fiction, that sort of utopian scientism, orderly science fiction that where technology was good and it got us to the stars, and we created these orderly empires in the stars, whether it's Asimov or Frank Herbert's Dune. That's that type of vibe. And as always, there is usually a reaction to it for whatever reasons. And cyberpunk, as the traditional story goes, came from New Age science fiction, pretty much pioneered by people like Michael Moorcock and Philip K. Dick. and other writers, and it basically turned things inside out as these deconstructive genres goes. Basically, it minimalized the orderly. Again, if we talk about Hermes, the opposite would be Apollo. So this was a reaction against the Apollo science fiction. So we got this world where the science and the utopia was minimalized, and people were cast into this world where technology was very questionable. And instead of utopias, we got dystopias with multinational corporations, shadowy governments, surveillance systems. And again, instead of the collective of traditional science fiction like Star Trek, it became more about the individual against the system. And as I will argue, is very Gnostic, because Cyberpunk certainly has a very existentialist vibe. It has the ideas of being trapped in a system and not understanding who the good guy is or what is the right reason, and that certainly that Gnostic vibe. I think it works out really well, because as the Gnostics 2,000 years ago, basically the issue is that we had fallen into matter. That was their big idea. In Cyberpunk, I think it follows more into what Eric Wargo said when he did his analysis of the movie Alien and the space jock, is we have fallen into technology, and somehow we're either trapped in this technology, or maybe technology isn't bad, but suddenly the technology is very questionable and it's being used against us and weaponized against us. And at the end of the day, can this technology, surveillance, AI, robotics, help us against the fight of cyberpunk, which is again the fight of the individual against the collective, the oppressive collective. So that's more or less in a nutshell what cyberpunk is. But let us know, Gordon.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that. And I'm glad you mentioned Moorcock, right? Because for people who are maybe less well-versed or even just versed in the intricacies of sci-fi history, it was, from a publishing perspective, kind of ruled or reigned over or corralled by the editors of some magazines that were very, very important, like 3 or 4 main magazines. It changed a couple of times over the 50 or 60 years of its reign. And Moorcock was one of a handful of editors who kind of instigated essentially a new wave in sci-fi. And the pivot is, if you look at early sci-fi, it is a very gleaming, beaming, modernist idea that, and I love Jules Verne, but like the sort of Jules Verne idea of like our magnificent spaceships and the kind of like glory and inevitability of a rational scientific worldview's dominance over the galaxy, because we sort of expand out into the world in our chrome, right? And Moorcock was one of the louder voices in selecting other authors who were bringing trouble to that idea, and obviously William Gibson, because we're talking about we're talking about cyberpunk, was a main one. And as far as I know, the term was initially used for one of his short stories called Burning Chrome. And I think you've kind of painted the motifs of cyberpunk correctly, because it's really interesting to tell how, or to try and work out how it is different from dystopia. Because, and I think it is on that individual level, there's something from Burning Chrome, and it's a phrase that's escaped the short story, and many people don't even know that that's where it originates. But there's a phrase: the street finds its own use for things, and that is, I think that is what is the determining factor in what is a cyberpunk story, rather than a mere dystopia. So you have an almost like archonic or demiurgic level. In the overwhelming majority of cases for cyberpunk, it isn't a single tyranny. So you will have crime syndicates, and you will have corrupt corporations, and you will have failed or fascistic or both governments. And that is the kind of power structure layer in almost all cases. Obviously, some of the ones we're going to talk about, it's different. But the dominance is not total. And more importantly, the determining factor is the good guys, the protagonists, are either forced into or thrust into using the power structure or the technology on their way to freedom. So it's a classic hacker narrative, right? And I think that is why it is the most Gnostic of genres, right? Like it is a waking up into an idiot god's world. Like they're dystopian. You have crime syndicates and mega corporations, and these people are terrible, right? There's no one there's no one who's like good at or competently running reality in generally speaking in cyberpunk. They're all very like Yalda Bayoth about it, right? I think that's why it is so Gnostic. What do you reckon?
Yeah, well, yeah, nobody knows how to run anything. Kind of reminds me of today. Well, so these are cyber times. Exactly. Everybody's asleep at the wheel. But
yeah, and it's factions. It is
cartels here and there, everywhere.
And effectively, well, in that kind of, and this is beautiful, right? Like in that Borg Queen sense, you imply a disparity where none exists. We have governments, we have incompetent governments, but we also have governments that are effectively run by the factions that we're talking about anyway. So you think, well, this is what I mean, why I'm glad we're doing this show, because I went down the list, the sort of realization, I think we have to go through a cyberpunk phase, and it's kind of a little wink to Marx, because people don't realize how silly in many respects Marx's metaphysics was, even if his class analysis was quite good, because he thought civilizations had to go through a capitalist phase to realize that communism is what was needed, and then communism itself would go through its full statist phase until it all kind of, they fixed everything, and then the state would wither away and we'd be in some kind of agrarian and anarch utopia, right? And so that's silly. It's lovely, but it's silly. And I have a similar idea of like, well, how do I get to solarpunk? And it looks like, oh, maybe Marx was kind of weirdly right about cyberpunk. Maybe civilization has to go through its cyberpunk phase. And I was ticking off all the things that make it its own distinct genre. And I'm like, yep. And in particular now, this particular apocalypse, one of the recurring motifs is not just that it's about data and surveillance and technology. In the majority of cases, it's biotech, right? So it's the interface of the human organism and digital or machine systems. So it is the cyborgification of, among other things. And that's where you get a lot of the reality exploration and so on. It is the interface between the analog and the digital, or the organic and the inorganic. And that is, we are literally in, whatever you think is going on, a collection of false realities that will end in some kind of chip-based biotech system. You think, wait a fucking minute, we're in cyberpunk times.
That's a book of Revelation. What are you talking about?
Yeah. Book of Revelation.
Yeah, no, I wanted to add to it. Yes, like you said, it's the individual trying to understand himself and the blurry world, which goes right to the heart of Philip K. Dick and his two questions. What is reality? What does it mean to be human? And cyberpunk, that's at the heart of cyberpunk. And of course, technology makes it even messier or cleaner at the end and leaves it sort of open-ended how technology is going to play, just like today. But I'd like to go back even more in time to understand, because I think this has to do with our relationship with technology. Again, we were talking about traditional science fiction as, hey, technology is beautiful, is wonderful. It's like listening to a Rush album where Neil Peart thinks that technology is the greatest thing. But when we go back in time, especially, and I'm referring to the great book by Adrienne Mayer, Gods and Robots, she talks about how the Greeks had this very much cyberpunk mentality, because they were always wondering how the techne, which meant the craft, could either help or hinder human beings. And of course, we go to the two great Gnostic ancient tales, which is the myth of Prometheus and the Plato's allegory of the cave. Obviously, Prometheus goes and he steals fire for the god, which is the great metaphor for technology, brings it down like some Nephilim or Watcher. And even in Plato's allegory of the cave, we are in the shadows, but they're using technology to throw those shadows on the wall. So the techne is there. So the Greeks really wondered how technology could how it affect. Was it a good thing to steal from the gods? How could it bite us in the ass? And you see that very much in the Greek myths, like the myth of Talos, the myth of Pandora, obviously the myth of the flying guys. What was it? Icarus and Daedalus. You see that over and over. And of course, this expanded even into reality. There are stories of kings trying to work with robotics in their courts. When the men, they created armor, you're talking about biotechnology, they would have the armor would have nipples. I'm going to say it, nipples for men. But so the Greeks had this fascination with the biotechnology in cyberpunk, and it's sort of as I keep going, it's a mixed bag how that would work for them. But they were certainly trying to understand these things, and you wonder how cyberpunk would really work out through. It's something that the kingdoms in China, they were doing robotics too. They were wondering how technology and humanity would mix and coexist together, and whether it was a good thing or not, this gift from the gods, this technique. I was even thinking you might even make an argument that the first real cyberpunk novel might have been Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, because it is a Promethean novel, and it is the blowback and the potential and dangers of technology and creating something new out of this union and trying to understand the individual and his relation with the artificial.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I thought about whether Frankenstein fulfills at least how I've defined for myself, because obviously there isn't like a canonical definition of it, cyberpunk, and I think it isn't because of the protagonist. And because the other influence, there's sort of two other influences that I think are important before we get to the films to chat to, the kind of, or tributaries that flow into cyberpunk as a filmic genre in particular. And the first is the rise of the kind of gumshoe detective in the Depression era and immediately afterwards. And that, much like cyberpunk itself, emerged from an economic reality. So one of the things that defines a hardened gumshoe rather than a Sherlock Holmes is class-based for a start. So if you look at detective novels in the 19th century, it was actually more of that, the inevitability of a rational worldview overcoming superstition, and it was a class attack. Like, that's essentially what goes on in something like Sherlock Holmes. With a hardened gumshoe, what you actually get is someone who is aware of two things, or it has to do two things: navigate a world that's run by a corrupt elite, because the post-Depression era, that became obvious, right? So the people who survived from the Gilded Age did so via corruption, and the DuPonts and Morgans and so on, right? So the classic story is of the femme fatale, or the exotic widow coming in, and you get moved into this corrupt world of powerful people. But the other thing is, the hardened gumshoe has had to live through the effects, and he is basically just trying to make a buck. So he begins in an amoral state, and the story of the novel is him actually realizing or uncovering or demonstrating that he does have a morality or a heart somewhere in there in the end. So that is the hardened gumshoe motif is a very important tributary into it. And much like cyberpunk, which emerged in a Reagan-Thatcher era of just hyper ultra capitalism and corporations running riot over the planet, you get that same awareness of like a class positioning and that kind of like, I have to live in this system, but only as a means to get out of it. And the other one, of course, is French comics and generally speaking, even French film. There's a real French influence on cyberpunk. One of the films that didn't make it, which is actually a brilliant movie regardless, because it doesn't quite satisfy it, although you could make a case, is Alphaville, which is a Godard film from the 60s. And it's black and white, and it's shot, Paris stands in for this galactic capital, and it's a real obviously it's a new wave, but it has this sort of new wave, black and white, really lyrical and dreamlike. And there's no sets necessarily, so the exteriors are just Paris, and they picked some sort of modernist and brutalist buildings for the interiors, and it somehow works. You end up in this, like it's a classic galactic capital versus, and the protagonist is from like the outer colonies, so it's the usual colonial story and so on. But I think those two bits mean that whilst Frankenstein is a masterclass in sitting with the pros and cons of technology and what it can and can't do for us, there's that little bit of extra Gnosticism that's required, I think, to make cyberpunk.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think you're 100% right about the sort of the noir feel of cyberpunk. Of course, I'm sure the panelists, everybody's probably thinking of Deckard in Blade Runner, who's the classic cyberpunk hero. And like you said, he is basically comfortably numb. He's dead, almost soulless, and it's only towards the end. It's almost like you have to be that way to survive this the whole cyberpunk reality again, where you don't know where truth is coming or what's real and what's not real. So yeah, I would agree with you there 100%.
All right. Well, I think we've got the other thing I want when we chat at the end, after we do our countdown, one of the things I want people to think about, because the genre was so influential that, for instance, I'll just tell you this isn't on it, but I went to include the Hunger Games franchise on my top 10 until I realized it's actually, quote unquote, just a dystopia, but it's one that has been heavily influenced by a lot of the films that I think we'll be exploring here. So when we're going through the list, and people obviously may have their own lists, Miguel and I have tried to stick as close as possible to what actual cyberpunk films are as we define them. And actually, I think there's some slight disagreement, which should be fun, as to how that definition works. But I was thinking, for instance, Star Trek, if you consider the last sort of chunk of Voyager and some of the more recent films, and Discovery and Picard are almost cyberpunk. And weirdly, Picard is almost cyberpunk if you've seen the series, because it is about the Federation is fraying, and all of a sudden you realize there's total surveillance and different factions and all the rest of it, and the characters end up being moved through that thing. It's almost cyberpunk. It's not, and it's a really good example of how influential this genre is in ways I don't think people realize. Cool.
Good deal.
All right, so I'm just going to move some. Where's my mouse gone? So many screens. I'm just going to move some things around. Talk amongst yourselves. All right, move that screen to there. Embiggen this one. All right. When you do this takes forever. Sorry. Surprising, like my this is a semi-recent MacBook Pro. I hate it, but it becomes terrible when you're trying to do a live stream. It just everything goes. It's like no, you are in fact on Windows 95 at this point. Cool. So I will move this one back. Oh God. The other thing is Google Slides terrible. But if I move this one back,
now, and of course it should be mentioned even from the chat, everybody has their personal preference. There's no wrong answers because people are putting some really good films there. So
absolutely,
we will try to get to the main ones. I mean, of course, you're talking about the French films, The City of Children, and a few others that, I mean, we can spend hours with some excellent movies.
Yeah. Okay. So if I just do that, we come to number 10. And then we are actually in agreement. So how this works for people watching, if you can see the screen now, let me see if I can't move. The mouse is not obeying. If you look there, you will see we have Terminator 1 and Terminator 2. Now, Miguel's choices are on the left. So my choices are on the right. We agree in position number 10. So why Terminator? And by the way, we should also mention Miguel and I agreed to consider a film to represent its franchise and also its reboots so that we can talk about them. But why Terminator?
Yeah, well, hopefully we won't talk much about the Terminator reboots because they've been pretty much dreadful. I didn't see the last one. I think my wife saw it, and it was just Well, here we are at the end of the world. That's all I have to say. But yeah, Terminator it has to be a cyberpunk movie because again, we are talking about as we're talking about the ancient Greek idea. It's the union of the flesh and the machine, and and how can this machine benefit or harm us? And that's the interesting thing, as one of the questions in cyberpunk you're always going to have is, can machines have sentience if they interact enough with human beings or enough work is put into them? And can they have any sort of empathy? Obviously, Terminator 1, that's pretty much set in stone, no. But Terminator 2 works on that, where the machine can have empathy. And as we go later to some of the movies, I'll give my stance of whether machines can have empathy or not. But yeah, I think it definitely fills all the slots. Of course, James Cameron? We, of course, I would like to include too Strange Days, because that's another one of his films, very underrated film that deals with the whole idea of virtual reality and addiction to a virtual reality and so forth.
Yeah, that's all very good. And in particular, the first one, it's in the 80s, and just from a filmic perspective, it looks like a cyberpunk film, and deliberately so. So it has all the actual visual references as well, and that you'll see with some of mine, my film school pompousness will come out, but I think when we're talking about films, that's definitely the case. But I mean, it's Skynet, it's the rise of machines, and it's how humans have to reposition and potentially overcome, in aggregate, the Terminator universe, potentially overcome that, and whether or not it was a mistake. But the first one in particular, if you're looking for like visual cues, it's one of the better 80s depictions of it, right? So, all right. Number 9. All right. So why Fifth Element, and why is it in 9th place?
That's a good question. I was pretty much on the fence with that one for the most part, but then I just had to give in because of its Gnostic themes and the Sophianic character being so alchemical and a magical film. But I think at the end of the day, it does have that cyberpunk atmosphere of the chaotic governments. Again, the main government is buffoonery, as the governments today, as the governments in cyberpunk. It's got all the different factions vying for these issues, and it's got it's got the feel, the aesthetic, the science to it, and I don't think it's as goofy as it can be. It's not a utopian movie. It's definitely a dystopian movie that shows us that that even if we expand ourselves into the stars, we're going to be dealing with the same shit we're dealing down here on planet Earth.
Yeah, I like it. I wouldn't have gone that angle, but that's all really cool. For me, it's further up again because filmic nonsense. It's almost as if someone commissioned not like a cyberpunk film, but a film about cyberpunk, or even a painting about cyberpunk, because it is deeply embedded in the motifs, and it's just such a beautiful depiction of it. You have the class elements, like he's a taxi driver. You have all those sort of themes of the cyberpunkish cities, and because it is French, but it very clearly harkens back to the sort of Valerian 70s comics kind of motif. So again, kind of like Terminator, filmically, it absolutely belongs in the top 10, because it's almost like a meta cyberpunk film, because it's a love letter to them, if you will. Mm-hmm. For me, Max Headroom, for people who don't know, because they're like, I thought that was a TV show, it became a TV show. It started off as a telemovie on Channel 4 in the UK in the 80s, and why it's on the list, a couple of reasons. It's to deal in an era of kind of like fake news and post Mockingbird and all the rest of it. It gets strangely more current, even if it is clunky. But it was also the first kind of like explicitly commissioned cyberpunk film. Max Headroom was commissioned as a cyberpunk film. So for the list that's there, I last time, I haven't watched it for a few years, but I found the full thing on YouTube a few years ago. So if no one's actually seen 20 Minutes into the Future, it's a Channel 4 telemovie, and you can find it elsewhere. You can probably pay for it, like rent it on Play or something. But for me, it belongs in there because it has there's obviously the human computer interface and the fact that they I forget the main character's name, who becomes Max Headroom. They have like a digital version of him and all the rest of it. So that's why for me it's on the list. But I felt it's almost bending the rules because it's a telly movie, but we didn't specify whether or not it had to have a theatrical release, I guess. But it's one of the, for me, like the cornerstones of it. All right, clicking. Sorry for the delay. 8. So we discussed initially whether we would include animations or not, and I made the decision not to because I could actually fill up half my list. If you think about Akira and Ghost in the Shell and so on, I could fill up half my list with them because they're all very good. So why Ghost in the Shell?
Well, to me, it's the perennial anime and authentic or standalone cyberpunk movie. I mean, after all, the question of how humanity and machinery will interact and blend and how it'll affect the rest of the society, I think it's the ultimate movie. Obviously, Motoko Kusanagi, the protagonist, she's very much a Sophianic figure. I think in the Gnostic text, as Sophia falls into matter, and again in Cyberpunk, you're falling into technology. You become fragmented. Your memory becomes fragmented, and I think one of the things Cyberpunk does well is it gets that more or less Cartesian idea of mind and body, and how when the two become too separate, the trauma or the damage is, whatever the duality is, matter, space, or technology and matter. And Ghost in the Shell certainly serves that in abundance. And of course, you've got the puppet master who seems to be a demiurge, but he's more of a Gnostic Jesus who's showing the protagonist how to remember things, how to get back, how to get around the false memories, and how to, despite the fragmenting of technology, the fragmenting of corruption, of a hard world, she is able to find individuation and wholeness through the movie. So it's definitely one of the best ones out there. And of course, it deals with artificial intelligence, virtual realities, and all these issues that have become more and more relevant, even if the movie came out, in the late 90s, mid-90s?
Mid-90s, yeah. I have nothing to disagree with there. I think it's a remarkable film. I just arbitrarily decided I will somehow include telemovies, but I won't include animations on mine. But if you haven't seen it, it's essential watching. For me, I think Lupa is the best cyberpunk depiction of time travel as a technology. So, and interestingly, the film creators name check, because I like films that are love letters, and it's clearly a love letter to a sort of aggregate Philip K. Dick world, or understanding of time and so on. And the filmmakers actually list some of their influences, and there's a whole lot of Philip K. Dick in there, but it's got all the other motifs. So you're dealing with crime syndicates in an unjust world, and the protagonist starts off as like a bad guy because he is one of these looping assassin types, and then has to kind of like realize and overcome the system. But it's also a sort of play on the technologies. So for me, I wanted to put something that does time travel in there, and Lupa, I think, is a reasonable depiction of it. I think I would even say a good depiction of it. I struggle to find, although time travel is in some films that are in the kind of cyberpunk and cyberpunk adjacent world, I think this is the highest degree of overlap between cyberpunk and time travel.
Yeah, I think Looper is an excellent film for all the reasons you get. It's as Dickin as you're going to get. And there's Bruce Willis again. I think we're going to meet Bruce Willis many times. So I don't know what the hell who's his agent from another time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is he like, it's either him or Keanu, but it's probably Bruce Willis, who's turned out to be the ultimate cyberpunk actor.
Yeah, the only reason I didn't include is because I'd already hit Terminator. I was like, now we're going to start adding time travel movies, which there are many great ones. But then I didn't want to become too much of a feature.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Sorry for the slow clicking on all of this. Number 7. Now, I love 12 Monkeys.
Bruce Willis. There we go.
I love 12 Monkeys. I need convincing that it's a cyberpunk film. So go for it. I love it. I think it's. I mean, anything Gilliam and Gilliam adjacent, I also love. But like,
I
why is it on the
anything
list for you?
Gilliam creates is cyberpunk. It's, I mean, his aesthetic. I mean, we are talking the connection of the very messy connection of machines and humans. Even Baron Munchausen kind of shows that. These really terrible dystopias and bureaucracies and dizzying worlds that the protagonist ends up with, where you're just being very Sartre, just sort of thrown around in a form of eternal nausea. So, and it certainly depicts again, the Phil Dickian idea of the every man against the system. That's Terry Gilliam, and it certainly I think it culminates very much in 12 Monkeys. And I just said about time travel, but oh my God, we just got another time travel movie. So I don't even, and I don't want to say a bad joke, but how could I be on a show without a bad joke? But we might have to put it under the new genre of virus punk that's coming
I love
out.
it. I love it. Yeah.
You know that Nicolas Cage is going to be in a movie soon, like saving people on ventilators and all, something like that. That's coming.
Funny you mentioned that, because I've mentioned last year that I did NaNoWriMo, so I'm kind of like halfway through a novel, and you're a novelist, and it occurs to me I'm halfway through something that chunks of it are actually set in like southern Spain and southwest France, and I'm like, is it novelist to novelist? Are we now permanently forced to have to mention this? Do you know what I mean? Has it permanently altered creative expression so that a novel will look weird if you don't have a throwaway comment about it? You know, I don't know what to do about it.
I don't think so. I mean, I don't think so. It can or cannot. I mean, you don't have to mention 9/11 or the Iraq War, or but then again, you kind of have to mention World War II if you're in that period. So I think it's too soon to tell.
You don't have to mention 9/11, but if you were to accurately depict the scene of moving through an airport, you do have to depict TSA stuff, right? So it's like,
that is true.
It's an interesting situation, given that we are going to head into that cyberpunk future of like digital immunity certificates and other such iconic nonsense.
Right.
Damn
it. Yeah, I think again with Hermes, it's innovation and kind of going with the flow, the god of transition. So you don't really look too much to the other side. That's for Apollo and Prophecy, and that age has not worked out very well. So I would highly recommend stick with Mercury right now. And but 12 Monkeys, I mean, what a relevant film. I mean, because you start looking at science fiction and a lot of novels, and this is probably the best one that has to do with a viral apocalypse, if you would.
Absolutely.
And it is, in fact, I mean, you are seeing now on social media, you see like animals in Venice, or animals are coming out on the streets. And at the beginning of the movie, it's amazing. You've got Bruce Willis up there out in the ruins because of the virus, and the giraffes have taken over New York. And it's, you know, as they say, Mother Nature has renewed, but somehow Mother Nature has not forgiven humans. So humans now have to live underground, and it's up to Bruce Willis to sort of go back in time and find out where this virus came from. And of course, that's the $64,000 question today. Everybody wants to know where the virus came from. So and that's just like the Bruce Willis character. We're not going to know for a long time. So I would say this is not even a virus punk, but also cyberpunk movie.
Yeah, why it's not on my list, because I love it, is I don't think it satisfied the protagonist layer, because it's a collapsed world. So I mean, I'd be surprised if people haven't seen it. So you do get close to a cyberpunk antagonist rather towards the end, but that was literally the only reason. Also, I ran out of spots, and you had already said it, so it counts. For me, like Total Recall, I actually watched the remake last night, and funnily enough, this is a good example in some places of where remakes can be better than the original. And let me be clear, I love the original. It was like a forbidden VHS tape that we would watch as kids growing up. And one of the things I realized I missed in the remake versus the original is Mars, because they don't actually go to Mars in the remake. They just briefly talk about it. But I think this is the first explicit appearance of PKD on the list, isn't it?
Yeah, it's on this list so far. Yes.
Yeah. I think it's, and I actually think the remake is more cyberpunk than
Hmm.
the original. Not that the original is a bad film, but this is a cyberpunk list because it's so, and it's such a good post-colonial film because the only things that exist are essentially the legacy of imperialism in the form of Britain and then like an expanded Britain and the colony, which is Australia. And those are the two things that are left. And that's a really clever way of exploring the power structure that we have to operate in, and the protagonist is involved in the undoing of that power structure by using some of the techniques and actually having been part of it, and it's just really well done. Remakes can be good.
Hmm. Yeah, I think my love hate with the remake again had to do with taking out the whole alien thing out of it, which drives me crazy. But of course, the conspiracy theorists is like, oh, this secular society, they just want to erase any possibility of exploring about aliens. But at the same time, then I realized, well, the thing is, Dick, when he was writing his stories, he had to include something alien, even if he wanted to write philosophical, mythical novels. I mean, even in Man in the High Castle, part of the thing is they're going to rockets to a colony of the moon. So on one hand, I knew Dick had to play the alien part, but on the other hand, it annoys me sometimes when they remove some of the, again, extraterrestrial parts of these movies and so forth. But all in all, it was okay. And who was the protagonist in the remake? I think I also have a love and hate relationship with
Do you
him.
mean
What's the name of the
Farrell?
Irish actor?
Yeah, Colin Farrell. He's also
Yeah.
in the list a couple of times.
Yeah. Bruce.
Yeah.
We got Bruce Willis, Arnold Schwarzenegger twice, and so
Yeah.
we'll see where it goes. So.
I would say is it doesn't replace the original. They're two excellent films. The first one is more Dickian in the sense that it is much more about the difference between like artificial and real dreams, and it does have the space thing. So it's much more about reality in a way that the remake isn't, because the remake is more kind of like on the political side of cyberpunk,
Right.
where it's a device to understand the character's journey and why he's confused and so on, where it's like it's a real bong rip cornerstone of the original film. So if like
Right.
for
And
me,
I think
it's
I should
kind of,
mention too.
yeah, go.
Yeah, why I have a soft spot for Total Recall or the director Paul Verhoeven is that he's very much like David Lynch. It's beyond his ultra violence and sort of cartoonish ways. He has a way where he's got this, for lack of better words, this Manichaean dualism where every character is extremely good or extremely evil. There's no in between, and that's a great place for a person's ego or shadow to play with, just as a David Lynch. Where am I in this place? And it's a great space for introspection, believe it or not, even with the insane plot and again the ultra violence and the silliness of his movies. Even Showgirls, you can make the same case for Showgirls.
You could, and this kind of comes back to, we were going to say it at the end. Well, I was going to ask you about it at the end, but it's come up now. And it's a real motif on your show about write your own gospel, live your own myth. And there's something medicinal, why we're doing this show, about cyberpunk that is explicitly Gnostic, where we're telling stories not as a kind of National Geographic catalog of reality, but a description of reality that is medicinal, right? So cyberpunk is as was the gumshoe and whatever, like cyberpunk is a response to conditions that is, I think, as accurate as a Google map, right? Like and I think that's one of the things that makes it the most Gnostic of film genres, that the stories it tells are completely true in the same way that, as far as we may surmise, and I think it's fair, it's as the way Gnostics use story. What do you reckon?
I would say so too. I mean, there's an ambiguity about it, even though, it's no secret that the Gnostics loved satire. Sometimes they were subtle about it. Sometimes they would hit you over the head. So this worked out to get their message. And again, we're talking about the ideas of what is the nature of reality, what it is to be human, what are the gifts of the gods, how dangerous they are, and our fall into technology. And I think, again, that's why Cyberpunk works really well. And again, I think there is an ambiguity because very much like Dick's novels and some of these movies we've talked about, including 12 Monkeys, Terry Gilliam is great at it too, about the sort of ambiguous ending that he does, like movies like Brazil, Total Recall. You really don't know if the ending is good or not, and you kind of want to get on the Ouroboros and just get right back at the beginning, because the ending was so, it's not your typical Hollywood ending. That it seems like the main character has been crushed or nothing has been resolved, like the dude in the movie where nothing gets resolved. What's the name of the movie? The Coen brothers, The Dude Abides.
Big Lebowski.
Yeah, Big Lebowski.
Yeah.
That's kind of a cyberpunk ending where nothing gets resolved at the end, and the character is not really wiser than before. So
yeah, I'm glad you described that sort of Gilliam ending. It's also there, as you mentioned, in Total Recall, right? Because it's a real Dick approach. I think that's why I didn't like Inception that much, but I think that's why Inception isn't on the list, because it actually hits a bunch of those cyberpunk things. It's because there are better treatments of that, and Total Recall is it of dream and reality and what happens at the end. And it doesn't make Inception a bad film. It just doesn't make it in the top 10, because Total Recall does it better, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, agreed. Or Brazil. You really don't know at the end what the hell's going on. Who's in the dream, and is it the God dreaming me, or am I dreaming the God? We just don't know.
Yeah. All right, so number 6. I'm so glad you included Logan's Run, because I didn't. So it's not a disagreement, but why?
Michael Landon and Farrah Fawcett. Is there anything else that we need to see when they were young?
Yeah.
No, obviously, again, I follow this under a very relevant movie today. I think they're making a remake, unless I was having a Total Recall dream, but they should. And this is the class. I mean, I was talking about 12 Monkeys when Bruce Willis goes to the top. And this is the strange motif you have in Logan's Run, is that we've been told there's a dystopia. We've been told there's been apocalypse. But is it really true? I mean, I'm not saying either way, but if I walk out, will I really get the virus? If I walk out to the total, and Logan's Run deals with this speculation, because we always wondered. I mean, our parents tell us, don't go out and play. Well, we got to find out. In Logan's Run, it's a great film, because at the end you find out that everything is a sham. The apocalypse was a sham. The sanctuary, everything is a lie. And it's almost like all these factions got together, and I don't know if they even believe their own lie, but they fell for their own lie, because I believe that at the end the computer can't believe that it's a lie, and this computer actually explodes when Logan tells them the truth about what's going on in the outside world. Of course, it gets into the very good question is how much of our rights are we willing to give to live in a utopia? Because in the movie, they live in this sort of mall, and they live very good lives. They live very well, but they have to sacrifice basically their own lives. At the age of 30, everybody has to be killed and shot, has to die, and they create these silly rituals where it seems like they're not dying; they're just being reborn or going to heaven or something like that. So we get into the themes of eugenics, which I don't think we've gone into yet, but that's an important theme if you're going to have a lot of these cyberpunk movies. Basically, who gets to die, population control, and what is the truth about our overlords, about what's outside into the world. Of course, I love the theme and the novel. I think you're 20 when they kill you, and they give you some happy drug and you die of happiness. But in the movie, I love the fact that the executors they're called Sandmen, and the symbol of the sanctuary from the fake utopia where they live is actually an Ankh, and this is the Ankh that he sort of follows. And so, yeah, great film, very relevant. I think that you could actually make it into a very good modern version. Maybe there'll be a virus out there, who knows? Not saying the virus is fake, don't take me wrong. I'm just saying we're playing with these ideas here, and what's interesting, somebody said at towards the end of the movie, they meet this big robot, and this crystal robot, and Logan has to fight it. And this robot has this powerful black voice, and this robot really made effect on the public. It scared the shit out. Some people say that sort of inspired Darth Vader to get James Earl Jones to get his role as Darth Vader, because it was such a very impactful scene.
I didn't know that. I can see how that may have been the case for sure.
Yeah, Box is the name of the robot. I forgot.
Yeah. Minority Report is actually another Dick inspired film. Is just generally speaking good, but it's made it to number 6 on the list for me, specifically for the surveillance biotech angle, like him having to swap eye. I actually watched it last night. Him having to swap eyes so he can kind of fool the bio-activated advertisements and get back into the building and so on. So that's why it's on a Cyberpunk list. I like it for a bunch of reasons. It's the kind of classic, the ones who walk away from Omelas Greek morality tale of like, can you live in a perfect world if there are people, a small amount of young people in a lot of pain for your benefit? And so it's sort of a PKD version of that for a start. And it also deals with something else which is now coming up as part of the biosurveillance grid we're moving into, which is pre-crime. So in the US in particular, they will be able to expedite already in trial systems of using kind of like predictive modeling, particularly once you are not allowed out of your house without the chip or the app on your phone, so that they know who you are congregating with, allegedly to allow contact tracing for a respiratory disease, which is it's mental, but that's going to be used for racial targeting. Please don't be a black male congregating with other black males or whatever. And so I think all this stuff is coming up, and the film's really good. I hadn't watched it for a long time until last night, and I'm like, hey, this one also has stuff to teach us about today, and it would be on a different list for the use of psi in governing and law enforcement. So it would be on like a secret space program kind of list as well, but it's on the list here for the biosurveillance interface and pre-crime as warning, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I would say it's one of the most chilling films to come out in the last 20 years, without a doubt. And it's that, and it's really part of our modern mythology, the idea, the themes that you find in Minority Report. The thing, I wouldn't choose it because Steven Spielberg directed it, and I feel most of the movie is what do you call it? Predictive programming. I remember sitting in the theater when it came out, movie 2003 or 4 or 2, yeah. And there's a scene where Tom Cruise walks into the Gap, and suddenly he gets a choice of his favorite thing, and I'm saying, why are they speculating on this in a very cyberpunk movie? They're stealing from the old age science fiction. I remember thinking, I bet this shit is coming down the pipe. And not just this shit, but all the shit in this movie is going to be a reality in the next 15 years. And lo and behold. And so, and I wish I could. And of course, I'm not in the camp saying Steven Spielberg is a visionary who's helping humanity. That's far from it. So,
no, that's trash.
It pisses me off.
Yeah, he's the ultimate insider. And there are some alarming, how shall we say, Me Too, but worse revelations to come about Mr. Spielberg. So there's an ultimate insider there. Hang on a minute. Did you have Minority Report? What was your 5? This might have been a slide error.
Yeah, I put 5. I did put Minority Report.
Okay, cool. Anything else we want to add to it? And
yes, he's gotten us. Steven Spielberg's not going to let us go. No, I mean, I'm trying to think. Tom Cruise, obviously. What's the name? The movie where he comes back over and over again. I don't know if you could say that. Yes, that's really one of his best movies. Absolutely, one of the best science fiction movies to come out in a while.
I thought that was great.
Think that would be Cyberpunk.
Yeah, people. I get why people go in and out on Tom Cruise, right? But one of my all-time favorite films ever is Magnolia.
And same here.
he was so good in that I don't care what else he does.
Anybody in that movie, any actor in that movie.
Oh, exactly.
They killed it.
Yeah, and you do watch. So I watch him in. I won't preclude watching a film with him in it, because I think he's good, and I also think, given that he's so powerful in Hollywood, and he's got science fiction as a religion, I think he makes really good science fiction choices. Like Edge of Tomorrow, not that many people. Well, it still made money, but like it wasn't as big as it could have been. But it's really good.
Yeah, it's not a game changer. Of course, Oblivion, which is a very Gnostic film. I mean, an excellent movie. Got him his typical 100 million at the box office, but it certainly have more of a cultural impact. Those two movies for sure.
Yeah, nice one. All right, so RoboCop. That's another one I watched yesterday. Now I was messaging my little brother because it's kind of a film that we watched until the tape broke as children, and he reminded me that first time he went to get it with his friend, he would have been about 10 or 11, and walked down the road to a video store combined with a corner shop or bodega or whatever you want to call it, right? And it was all very manual, so he knew, I think it was E11 or E17 or something was the card number for our mother's card. And it was all in a book, so the guy who knew us opened up the book and saw it there, and it had my mother's name and phone number. And it's an R-rated film, right? So he rings up my mother and says, I've got Martin here, that's my little brother. Do you give him permission to rent this film called RoboCop? And she said yes. But like, if you think about it, RoboCop sounds like a child's film. Like it's a cop and a robot. So I think she said, yeah, I guess. And anyway, because we were chatting last night, one of his earliest memories in life, not just in film, is RoboCop shooting that guy in the dick.
Everybody loves that. To me, it's that melting guy who gets run over by the car. No, does anybody remember that scene?
Yeah. This is such kind of like Terminator. This is canonical 80s cyberpunk. It has it all. It has corrupt governments. It has a world run by corporations. It has the class cruelty, not even just like class war. And you also have the playing really masterfully with the biotech interface, but also the kind of like hardened gumshoe idea where the protagonist is essentially working for the bad guys and was made by the bad guys, and there is no bad in RoboCop, and I hadn't watched it in years, and I watched it yesterday. The only thing I didn't realize, and we were kids when we watched it, I'm like, there's a lot of male nudity in the first film.
Oh yes, I mean, what can we say about Robot? Like you said, it really is the ultimate film about fascism. I mean, this is it, when you've got business and government working together to create this perfect system, and of course, there's a huge underground mafia sort of world. But of course, you find out, as you always do, that the mafia underground has been working for corporate America the whole time. That's when people ask me, well, what are you going to do about the Mexican cartels? It's like, haven't you figured out
oh my God,
who runs the Mexican cartels? They're financed on this side of the border. But of course, people can't understand that. But RoboCop just shows us that it's all one. It is one government. It's just an evil empire. So,
yes. Yeah.
And obviously, it's a very much, unlike many of the other cyberpunk movies, it's a beautiful Jesus story about resurrection and redemption. Again, it's got that Manichaean, Verhoeven, every character is either a complete psychopath or every character is just pretty cool. So, and I think there's a new movie that came out with Van Diesel. I think it's called Bloodsport or Bloodshot, but I hear that is very much, it's a complete ripoff, not a complete, but it's an homage to RoboCop if you watch it, and it has to do with false memories and all that good stuff. Of course, oh my God, I don't know what else to say. It's such a good film. I didn't like RoboCop 2, and I know people say, well, it's like, what happened with Frank Miller? What happened to his script? And people say, well, they ruined his script. I was like, RoboCop 2 wasn't good. RoboCop 3 sort of brought it back, but the first one is still a standalone masterpiece.
Yeah. I watched RoboCop 2 as a kid, so I remember it more fondly, but realistically, it's not good. The first three, it's a fake trilogy where the first one is just perfection and the other two also exist, and you may as well watch all three, right? I haven't watched and probably will never watch the remakes. So
yeah, there was not much to it.
Okay.
Yeah, there's really not much to talk about with the remake. So it's just it just couldn't capture what the director was doing.
And in fourth place, getting close to the podium, a film I think we expected everyone knew was going to be on the list. And again, we're talking about. Well, I'll ask you this: are you referring specifically to the film or the franchise in its entirety?
I guess I'd give the same answer you did with RoboCop. It's like
right.
The first one stands alone, but you might as well enjoy the other two. So it's like, so that's there's not much else we can say. It's the great Gnostic gospel. It's the great cyberpunk film. Of course, it's the great myth of our era. It is everything. You just wonder what the Wachowskis were able to get right. Again, predictive programming. Obviously, they were influenced by Grant Morrison. They were heavily influenced by Philip K. Dick, Neoplatonism. I mean, it seemed like this perfect storm. And if we have time, I'd like to talk about the sort of, and we talked about this with Chris Knowles about what was going on in the late 90s, where you had incredible cinema, cyberpunk, science fiction, and Gnostic cinema, and how it just died out after the millennium. But The Matrix has to be the culmination of this sort of Gnostic, cyberpunk, techno-gnosis, transhumanism genre that was coming in the late 90s. Of course, you can include Millennium, the X-Files, and other content out there.
It's a masterpiece. It's the one in addition to the other film, which people can probably work out is further up the list, that has to belong on a top 10 cyberpunk ride. Interestingly, I think it gets more cyberpunk as the series goes on, right? So again, it comes back to how we view the antagonist or the archonic layer, because in the first one it appears to be a single antagonist. But what you get is a bit more nuance, and there are in fact factions, not just amongst the humans, but amongst the machines that sort of split apart as part of the creation story. So it actually gets more rather than less cyberpunk as it gets messier. And I wrote a blog post, which is for that reason, years ago. I was still in London. Reality isn't the Matrix. Reality is the shitty sequels, and it's kind of it's a true statement for now as well, where it is that kind of mess of people wanting to wake up and not wanting to wake up, and we're noticing that with our friends and neighbors and so on, the people who have been utterly mind controlled by the fear of whatever parts of going on are an op, and big parts of it clearly are. And it's really interesting to see some people will go out of their way to remain plugged in as a fear-based response. So it's a glorious mess, and visually it is hyper cyberpunk, right? Rather than like just pure cyberpunk. In my case, in The Fifth Element, like that's a love letter to cyberpunk. The Matrix is, I don't know how else to say it other than it's a hyper cyberpunk. So it's stylized the motifs rather than I don't know, written a love letter to them. But for me, that from a filmic perspective, Fifth Element is further up the list for that reason, that it's just such a beautiful exploration of the motifs. But we've already discussed it, so
I guess I like this also too. I don't know about the Matrix 4. I guess that's coming down. I think with the Matrix and RoboCop, and this terrible analogy, but it feels like you have a great orgasm, and then your partner wants to do it again, and then the third time, and you're like, oh, fine, it's okay. But I think that's how it is. That's how it's going to be with the Matrix 4. It's like, just get it over with, hon, so I can go back.
Yeah. Like, yes, it's consensual, but
it's consensual. I'm participating. I'm gonna go pay money. But the things we do. But the Fifth Element. Speaking of virus punk, besides 12 Monkeys, you would have to look at the Resident Evil. I think Mila and those films have everything. I mean, the bioengineering, the world government, the virus, the surveillance. It's got everything. As goofy as Resident Evil is. It's full of you might say predictive programming or prophecies for today, and in a lot of ways it is cyberpunk.
It is. It's close. That's for sure. I like the idea of virus punk. We should do a list of what build a genre that is needed for now. All right, so we make it to the podium now. Gattaca isn't on my list and I love it. I watched this film so many times, but it's not on my list because it doesn't satisfy for me the antagonist, the multiple antagonist situations. It's close. It has like the underworld and so on. But it's glorious, and it's about that kind of weird. And what's happening with part of the op is they're activating childhood fears and also childhood conditioning around cleanliness and being icky. And for people who were raised, older generations were raised with an approach to cleanliness that was highly dysfunctional, and I love that Gattaca plays with eugenics, and it plays with that sort of cleanliness and cleanliness being a component of the totalitarianism that people are stuck in. But it's number 3 for you. So like, tell us why.
Yeah, I think it was number 3 just because of relevance. Again, I'm trying to think of virus punk too as we create our new genre, and you hit it on the head. Engineering, who are the dirty ones, who are the underclass, who quote unquote will have the virus. And of course the ending is one of the most beautiful endings, as much as Ethan Hawke can't so he just looks bored half of the time in it, but that speech at the end about being part of the stars is just, it brings tears in my eyes every I see him. And Jude, and of course there's another one. Remember back in the 90s when Jude Law was in every other film?
Oh, totally.
It's totally. Like, what was he doing? How did he do that? And some of them were very good. So, but I have to add, of course, I have to attach existence to that. And again, this is part of this wonderful impulse or content put out in the late 90s. If you include the 13th Floor, you include it, Existing, Gattaca, The Matrix, and several other films. It was, I always wonder what was going on in the minds of these creators that was bringing. Was it a millennium thing where it was at sort of the Philip K. Dick tipping point because so many have been influenced by this? And what happened to this genre? It's like, I mean, I know you, Chris, and I talked about, of course, new atheism came about, which was completely engineered, and that sort of snuffed out the imagination of humans and got us easier, of course, with the Patriot Act and the bloody wars and all that mess of the early 21st century. So it is a mystery, but Gattaca is definitely part of that wonderful dying cyberpunk genre that died at the end of the 20th century.
So my speculation on that is that it's 3 factors. It's obviously the looming millennium, but it's a looming millennium after 2 things have happened, which is the rise of the internet and the fall of communism. So that you're actually dealing with the kind of end of history moment before we realize that was a dumb way of thinking about economic history. But there's a few years there where it's like, well, what do we do now that we appear to be in the system that is permanent and correct, and we have these digital systems, and we're heading to the edge of the millennium? And I think it's sort of 3 things that allowed for a kind of haunted utopianism, right? Because there's an optimism in some of these incredible films and TV shows, but it's a haunted optimism. It's like there's something eerie or uncanny about it, and for me that's the millennium ghost a little bit further up the timeline. But that's where I think a lot of it comes from. If you look at TV and so on, it's grappling with the end of adversaries, seemingly, and the rise of the promise of digital systems before we realized how much of a control thing that was. So you just got this like 7 or 8 years where you can make like a haunted utopia, and I think that's my guess anyway. That's if you, these things never work because to try and functionally explain art is always going to be a small component of a fuller explanation. But I think it's a confluence of those 3 things is my guess.
Yeah, it's a mystery, but one thing I would say to the viewers is, look, sometimes these pivotal times in history, like after 9/11 here in the West, you are going to see your senses being heightened. People are want to go take an inner journey. You're going to want to look for lack of better words, cleaner forms of spirituality, ask the big questions. And I would say, whatever happens, there is a manufactured religion and philosophy and spirituality on the other side waiting to trap you.
Yeah.
So don't fall for it. Think of Mercury. Think
Yes.
of chaos, innovation, tricking people. Don't watch out for Apollo, because that's coming in the next few months or within the year. It's happened before and it's going to happen again. So be careful.
Yep.
Think of Mercury and his wings.
Yep. I love it. I love it. All right. I have nothing else to say about The Matrix other than it's on the podium for me for all the reasons we discussed on the previous slide. So let's go to number 2. All right. So you put RoboCop.
Mine is RoboCop. Yours is
Silver medal. Anything else you want to say about RoboCop, or did we hit that?
No, I think we hit. I think we hit all the high notes.
So because we were talking about Terry Gilliam being one of the kind of like ultimate cyberpunk filmmakers. Apparently, I have a memory that he's problematic now. I think he gave like a really sexist interview a couple of years ago or something. I forget how these things go. I think he got cancelled a couple of years ago. Whatever. I think this is, and everyone says this about all of Terry Gilliam's films except Brazil and 12 Monkeys, but I think people have slept on this one hard. I think this is, in many respects, his most cyberpunk film because it has everything. It has, and it has the kind of like spiritual meaning quest to do with whether God exists or how you get meaning into like this kind of hyper corporate, crazy hierarchical advertising filled world, and there are kind of subtle Jesus motifs in there as well. Like the main character's friend, for want of a better term, is like a young kid, and it's the son of the guy who's running the massive corporation, and all these kind of things. And I just think visually and the things I'm very interested in are obviously the motifs and the thematic points, and they just perfectly overlap for me in A Zero Theorem. If people haven't seen it, you'll look crazy. It is it's just, if you have to like Gilliam, and it's difficult not to, but I just love everything about it. I love the sets. I love that most of it happens in like a rundown church, and it's just so good.
Yes, it's a very good film, and it's hard to even say my favorite Terry Gilliam film is almost it's a stupid thing to say, because they're all they all have a place in time and a place in your mood and your heart and everything else. But they're all, again, they deal with these themes of dystopia and trying to, and of course, we should say that part of cyberpunk is very philosophical. It's always, it pretends it's nihilistic, but it's actually very philosophical. Absolutely. It's not sort of socio-political, like, again, old age science fiction.
Yes, and given that it has kind of two dads, Gibson and Dick, it's not that Gibson isn't philosophical, but like Philip K. Dick was one of the most important, if not the most important, philosophers of the 20th century writing in English, right? So when you find philosophy in cyberpunk, you can thank PKD for it. That's not sleeping on Gibson. I like him.
There's a reason I don't put Gibson at the top of any of my book lists, because, again, he doesn't have that intense philosophy, and that philosophy is what really drove RoboCop, The Matrix, Terry, that's what those questions about reality and humanity.
Right. All right. Well, people in the chat, you may have noticed a certain film hasn't made it on the top 10 yet, and we move to the final slide. Whatever could it be?
Yes.
I like some other films on my list. Zero Theorem, for instance, much more than I like Blade Runner as the original film, but it is impossible. It is impossible. Blade Runner crawled so the rest of them could run. this is where like cyberpunk film has its day one, you know, and it's not that it's bad, it's a masterpiece. And I even like 2049. I watched that again, did a rewatch of that recently.
Very good film, yes.
Yeah.
Unnecessary but good. I guess that like second sex again.
Yeah, because I did a film degree, as I've mentioned a couple of times already. So we watched Blade Runner a bunch of times, which means I haven't watched it in years, right? Because it's actually quite plodding. And if you know what's happening, it's beautiful or whatever. But it was interesting watching 2049 again the other night, like on the weekend, because it's almost like an audio commentary of the original film. So in that sense, it's redundant, but in another sense, it basically just makes the first film deeper in my head, if that makes sense. And so, yes, we're including Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049 in this, but this has not just, it has all the motifs. This is where those French Mobius and all the rest of it influences landed in English-speaking cinema, and all the other things that go with it, that define the genre, from like color palette, from in-scene lighting, which is a real sort of like, that's a Soderbergh influence on Soderbergh, but having all the advertisements and the light reflecting from advertisements into puddles, and rather than kind of externally lighting a scene in a classic film sense, this just paints a cyberpunk perfection with kind of like light and obviously the soundtrack, the Vangelis soundtrack. Like there's no part of this that you can criticize. I mean, tell us about Blade Runner, Miguel.
No, God, and Sean Young was so beautiful. But you watch her in another movie, she's the different Sean Young. That's how amazing this magical, purely magical. I mean, you said it all, and I think even as a companion, I think we have to look. Do androids dream of electric sheep? Of course, again, some consider it one of the earliest forms of cyberpunk fiction, and I see them as a complement, as an arc. I mean, it has to be mentioned. One of the big questions, and we talked about, could artificial intelligence or robots be sentient or be considered alive? Now, Dick was very, very stern of what he thought. He said, no way. Machines can never be sentient. You can never trust them. And for the most part, you should, shoot him like Roy Batty. I think that was his attitude on any sort of artificial intelligence or life. And that's his great warning. Of course, that great warning seems to have been forgotten. I don't know how people feel today, but obviously Ridley Scott had to go another route, which is suspicious in itself, because obviously we're talking about Steven Spielberg. You got to put Ridley Scott and these sort of social engineers up there. But Ridley Scott disagreed, and obviously by Blade Runner, machines can be sentient. And in the last Blade Runner, it really takes it to more, I think it's more ambiguous heights, but I think it almost works well to blend the two and reconcile them, which is one of the things I like about the Blade Runner 2041. And of course, this one's even more Gnostic. I mean, you've got Wallace, who's the great demiurge. I mean, Tyrell was just sort of your old school businessman, scient, a technocrat, as we might like to say. But Wallace is a messiah, a dark messiah, and he's obviously a demiurge figure beyond his idea of creating. He calls his replicants angels, which are straight out of the Gnostic Gospels. He's blind, which takes us back to the name of the demiurge, Samael, which means the blind god, and some other features. So I like how they really raised the Gnosticism of it, and the aesthetic of the movie is gorgeous. I love the pacing of the movie, but I still would have been fine if it would have never been created.
Yeah, absolutely. It was just like an astonishing bonus, and it's interesting that it has it's like Cyberpunk has had to update its dystopian parameters, or expand rather than update its dystopian parameters from a hyper-capitalist city, because it is, like all science fiction for the most part, it's one of the defining features, extremely, predominantly 95% urban and deeply urban, like collapsed cities urban. And this one has more of that. San Diego is now Los Angeles garbage dump, and there are children you can buy who are working in there. So it has a kind of like a a political comment on, you know, places like India where stuff like that can unfortunately happen, and the kind of artificial food farms and all the rest of it which are coming through. So it's sort of expanded outside of the city the cyberpunk's focus on how we live to like, well, how do we live a cyberpunk life? And it's like, well, it turns out we build it on child cruelty and artificial food made of bugs, both of which are features of the 21st century.
Yeah,
All
I
right.
think, great film. I mean, honestly, as good as it was, I would have to admit that probably my favorite cyberpunk movie in the last 5 years would have to be X-Men Days of Future Past. But I didn't want to bring it up because I didn't want to give the director any sort of love, you know, too much promotion for obvious reasons.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm going to turn off the share now and we'll go back to normal screens. Yeah, but Blade Runner is at the top of the list because it has to be, because that's the law. And but it's not. Maybe I watched it too many times in film school. But something like, if you want the visuals of Cyberpunk, Fifth Element, for instance, has a high degree of rewatchability just because it's pretty. You don't even need to be paying attention to it. I can't. For me, Blade Runner is the masterpiece, ultimate best cyberpunk film that I very rarely watch. All right, so is it? Let's do like a little post analysis here. Is it identical to Gnosticism? Is that going too far, or is it the most influenced by Gnosticism? Was it, and here's the next bit of that same question, was it deliberately influenced by Gnosticism, or is it more this kind of story erupts from the unconscious at Gnostic times?
Yeah, I think it creates a space where Gnosticism plays so well. Again, we go to the themes of falling into technology versus falling into matter, false realities, levels of false realities, and sort of all these archonic figures that are controlling your life while you're attempting to find out who you are. Obviously, if we talk about one of the grandfathers or one of the dads, Philip K. Dick, he wasn't just influenced by Gnosticism. He had a Gnostic experience. So, and even before he had his 374 experience, he had his demiurge experience in the late 60s where he saw this Iron Man in the sky and it freaked him out and he realized what the nature of the universe. So I think science fiction with its ideas of cyberpunk was the idea of trying to the distrust of reality, the existential themes that you find it, and again the question of what it means to be human and how technology can help us or hurt us, which basically translate to the gift of the gods. How much to trust these gifts is always going to end up very Gnostic by default.
Yeah. Well, that's a good lead into Brett's question. What would you consider to be the first real cyberpunk movie ever made? He's thinking maybe Metropolis.
I was going to say that, yeah. Nailed it.
I get it. It wouldn't be wrong for me. Again, just because of that would be a fine answer. I think what Alphaville has, which is a later film, French in the 60s, is the gumshoe type protagonist. So I would say Alphaville, but Metropolis wouldn't be a wrong answer if this was like.
I would agree. I agree 100%.
Should you? This is from. I'm going to say Kane or Cyan Laurie. Should you class District 9 as a cyberpunk film? So I'm going to go with that's a dystopia that has been heavily influenced by cyberpunk. Again, I wouldn't disagree. I wouldn't flip the table over if you said no, it's a cyberpunk film. But I think because its themes are more, I think it seeks to explore race and dystopia more than the other cyberpunk themes. Right? I would say it's a dystopia that's cyberpunk influenced, but I don't care if if you want to say otherwise.
Yeah, that could be part of the virus punk because again, I think it leans too much on the extraterrestrial thing, which not like Total Recall, it's sort of there. But again, the idea who are the viruses in this movie, the extraterrestrials, and then the human becomes part extraterrestrial, and that's when he becomes the hunted, which is definitely a theme of today.
Brett, are there any ancient stories that can be considered cyberpunk? We did touch on some of them, and I think Plato's allegory of the cave is a real good one for a couple of reasons. It's not just about technology. It's actually about technology of control. What people maybe miss and take it as a story of mysticism, which it is, it's discussed or told in the context of essentially how you get a populace to do what you say. So it's the dialogues the discussions that it happens in and around it are essentially like how you control the population. And then it's like, well, how about you engineer an entire reality? And that's kind of interesting. So whilst it's true that it's a good and meditative story on what's real and what isn't, and the difficulty in conveying that to people, it also could be like a map to a false flag. So let's not forget that that's in there. Any other ancient stories like Hindu myths?
I would say, well, the tale of Jason and the Argonauts, extremely cyberpunk. I mean, we do forget again when Jason, I know in the Hollywood movies, when he fights the skeletons, they were not skeletons, they were automatons. Again, Talos himself is the great sort of cyberpunk, or you might say artificial intelligence, who might be sentient but might not, might have feelings. And of course the whole idea, Medea of course is the great symbol of the pharmacy, the witch, and the gods themselves are plotting against humans with all this technology. And Jason sort of has to, well, he's got to find his way in between all these forces to get what he needs to do.
Yeah, there's classical Greek myths, and that was Brett's other suggestion. Vedic stories, like in the Mahabharata, you can make that case, but I think classical or ancient Greece rather is the best example, because it actually satisfies the antagonist not being in alignment thing, right? Because you have a bunch of different gods. No, it's not just the gods.
Fighting,
yeah. And what's so fascinating and useful about, although there's some shortcomings with it, but what's so fascinating about Greek thought is that it would be very specific about different kinds of thought and action. So techne is a really specific idea that they explored and haunted their culture and their stories. And that's not just Gnostic, that's quite cyberpunk. It's like, well, what the fuck even is like the application of tools on reality? Like, that's a weird thing. And it is a weird thing. And it's a really specific mode of thought that they explored at arm's length, and that plus the fact that you have different factions fighting each other in underworlds and on mountains and so on makes, generally speaking, I think ancient Greece the most cyberpunk of the kind of myth collections.
Right. And I think another important about cyberpunk, same with the Greeks and the Gnostics, is the idea that which is different than science fiction, is that technology can make us immortal. It can make us perhaps eternal. It can certainly make us completely godlike, and godlike meaning we're atop of the food chain. And those are the themes that are sort of explored, the dangers of technology and the dangers of whether dicks or the gods have technology.
Yeah.
So, do we use it against them before they use it against us? That's the big question, right?
Pretty much. So you talked about solar punk. What would be a good example of a solar punk film? I frankly don't think there are any. You'll find that anything that ends in a kind of eco-utopia ends up being really twee. I think you'll find motifs in things like Star Trek. So there'll be away missions that'll be on planets that are reasonably solar punk. But I don't think there are any good ones. And if you look at what the solar punk motifs are, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think the ultimate solar punk book is Always Coming Home, because it's a sort of future archaeology of like Northern California and the kind of arising systems and cosmologies and cultures that can happen after whatever caused the collapse of our civilization. But I don't know, can you think of anything solar punk?
That's not really my haven't gotten there, Gordon.
yeah, fair enough. It kind of has low or appropriate technology and dragons, and it's kind of hallucinogenic.
I like it already.
Oh yeah, it's almost like you would do. It's like permaculture on Mars, I guess.
Oh,
It's got like
cool.
water wheels, but also it's an internet and literary genre at the moment. But I think it's urtext, although the term didn't exist at the time, is always coming home.
Who's the bad guys in it?
Well, it doesn't. So it's got a few motifs like move quietly and plant things. So it's the bad guys are reality, but there aren't that many. It's utopian rather than dystopian. So Solarpunk is setting stories in a world either after a collapse where things are in fact good, whether we're living in a less hierarchical solar run world or whatever. It's rather than issuing warnings or exploring the dark, it's shooting for the positive. And that's what I meant by I'd hoped we'd get to live a Solarpunk life without going through Cyberpunk, because I was just going to do that. I moved down here, started my farm, whatever. Like, I'm just going to, you know what, fuck it. I'm just going to live Solarpunk. Unfortunately, we will all have to go through the Cyberpunk phase, which will likely cause the collapse that will hopefully afterwards end up in Solarpunk. But that's why
Right. It's got to be amazing, because I'm like, man, Gordon's in the middle of nowhere and he can have his rights suspended as easily as somebody in Chicago. That's how powerful the empire is.
Yep. Did not expect I knew it was coming. I just didn't think it was going to be the virus. Like the blended models that we talk about, the cycle models, got this right to the week that it started to happen. I just didn't think it was going to be a virus. And same thing. The whole point of a planetary control grid is that I will still need permission to go to my supermarket just as much as you'll need permission to go to yours.
No.
Where the fuck else can I live? Yep. They got me.
The chaos protocols too will have to deal with this.
How necessary is the theme of rebellion against the powers that be to the genre? Who are the punks? I think about that, and I think it's common, but the way I've redescribed it instead is the street finds its own use for things. So the trouble with a rebellion story and calling it that is the implication that what you actually do is overthrow the powers, and that doesn't happen as often as you think in Cyberpunk. But a personal freedom or a personal awareness is ultimately achieved. So I'm not sure. I mean, it's there, but I don't know if it's a defining feature of Cyberpunk. What do you think?
Yeah, and a lot of times these characters are thrown into these situations and they just want to get out a little bit better than how they started, and somehow they're able to take down an Archon or two. So it's not the sort of grand heroism that you might think of. It's but like you said, there's a lot of Archons out there, and if you can get out with just taking down one or two and somehow keeping a semblance of your sanity and your humanity, you've done well in Cyberpunk and in Gnosticism too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How does one? This is from Cesar. How does one think with the artificial or with the expanded nature idea of human beings? Part of nature, and that's human made is nature. So it's a techne question of, if humans make something, is it natural? And yes, it's part of it. I think this comes back to what I like about Gnosticism is its use of story as maps, so that you can, and I do, live an animist life that has Gnostic maps, because it's like, well, consider the following postulates as true, and then run this fucking program, this story about what reality might be like, or what reality is like in this story, and whether that is useful in your own kind of like flourishing or discovery. So ultimately, the entire universe is one thing. So it's the kind of classic, there is nothing unnatural in the universe. True enough, but by the same token, I would prefer rivers not polluted with the runoff from like rare earth minerals, rare earth mineral manufacture, and so on. So yes, but I think if we take the statement that things humans make is, in that techne sense, a different category of thinking, where we come to better conclusions. What do you reckon?
Yeah, and I think, well, I mean, ants make their molehills and the beaver breaks thing, but in Cyberpunk, you're actually becoming one with the technology. It becomes to infiltrate your consciousness, your health. You're joining again. I'm thinking of the Greeks and their armor with nipples, and Daedalus with the wings. I mean, that's the thing with Cyberpunk is that you and technology start to fuse together, and it becomes a challenge of when does it become traumatic? When does it take? When do you lose freedom over it, or when do you master this technology? It's again biotechnology,
Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
virtual worlds too. That's another aspect of it, of course.
So, do you think virtual worlds will be an aspect of virus punk?
Yeah, of course. I mean, God, look at how well people are acting on Twitter. I mean, the
Yeah.
collective shadow of humanity has come out and taking a big shit on anything good in this world.
And so, what I find fascinating, and I don't think this was part of the up. I just think it's a thing that the universe did because we're at a certain turning point. So if you look at what people who, and it's a class analysis, the people who are telling you to stay home the most are the ones that have the least to lose from staying home. And if you look at anyway, that gets really racist when it gets to New York, where it's impossible to social distance if you're black and whatever. But if you look at how, I didn't expect sourdough to be part of the apocalypse. That was a surprise. But the game that Twitter is talking about while we're all trapped in a house arrest or is playing is Animal Crossing, right? So it's actually a virtual world. So we're stuck in a house at the same time this virtual world that allows for digital connections with people who are also in house arrest. But it's an entire, like you build your own island and you grow things on it, you build houses. And so at the same time as we have prevented from living life, we're all playing a game and talking about it that is like a synthetic version of life. And I find that really fucking weird. I find that weird.
It is very weird. So.
Yeah. All right. Well, anything else you want to say? Any other films that you want to, or even stuff you want to point people at that didn't make it onto the top 10?
No, I think I don't want to overwhelm people. And again, people have been putting stuff in the chat room. I'm like, damn, I need to watch that movie again. So I don't want to overwhelm people. There's so many choices, so many good stuff. Again, I think I've given advice about what's coming. Please embrace Mercury. Please check out these cyberpunk films that we've just talked about of the late 90s. Maybe you'll find insights where we got lost and how did we get here.
Yeah, absolutely. And in the profoundly unlikely event that people don't know where to find you or how to find you, Miguel, what do they do and where do they go and what do you got going on?
Well, I'm under house arrest. What do you want me to go, man?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's a funny thing. My life has not changed. I'm still working like 60 hours a week. So it doesn't, keeping busy. And that's the other thing I was laughing, Gordon. I was like, you're going down Twitter and Facebook. And I'm like, I wonder if Gordon's thinking the same thing. Everybody's talking about Animal Crossing and getting their haircuts, but nobody's talking about reading your damn books. I mean, if I didn't have to make money, I could just, and somebody pointed a gun to my head, stay home, man, I'd be like, no problem. I've got years of catching up.
Yeah. Forget
virtual reality, forget Netflix, just open a book.
Yeah, and I'm very, like yourself, very lucky and fortunate to be in a situation where I, work from home anyway. I don't appreciate the house arrest at all. I hate it. But yeah, if I was, be like, okay.
Look at your bookshelf.
Look at the books. I have to do another one of these for books. All right, sir. And obviously,
godabovegod.com, yes. Or just type in Aeon, Byte, Gnostic Radio, and you'll find me, and I will find you. And there's many ways we can interact here in cyberspace as we're trapped in our meat space now.
Absolutely. Cyberpunk times. All right. Well, thank you very much, sir. And thank you, everyone, for the questions and the lively chat. Whenever I do these, I get really jealous of the chat because I could see it out of the corner of my eye and I'm like, oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, they're a blast. I love being in chats with guys.
So everyone who participated, thank you, like patrons and premium members and sanctum types, as I said, when our powers combine, we are the perfecti. So thank you very much. And Miguel, thank you. And yeah, this was
always fun, Gordon. Always fun.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to hit the stop button now and I'll work out how to switch off live streaming. But thanks everyone. I'm going to hit a whole bunch of buttons, and at some point it will kick you out. All right. See you guys.